This session is about reflex actions and reflex arc. And in this session we'll try to understand what reflex actions are and what is a reflex arc. In order to do that, let us first of all watch a couple of reflex actions here. And so here what you see on your screens at the moment is called a knee-jerk reflex. You see how a certain ligament is struck by a hammer and how the knee moves or jerks without the voluntary involvement of the individual. Let us look at another reflex action which is here. This is the dilation and undilation of the human pupil. Now here in this image it has been forwarded. This is a GIF image, and this is an extremely fast image, a rapid change. However, in reality you can also do this. All you need to do is focus a little light on your eye and you will see that this structure, this is the pupil, it contracts, and when the light is removed the pupil dilates, and you do not have to do anything about it. It just happens involuntarily or without your conscious effort. So what are reflex actions? A reflex action is a sudden involuntary response. Involuntary responses are all those responses which are beyond your conscious control. So an involuntary action is beyond your conscious control. For example, speech is a voluntary response. Chewing is a voluntary response. Breathing is a partially voluntary response. You cannot stop breathing because your diaphragm is beyond your control. So your diaphragm is under involuntary control of your brain. So what is the reflex action? It is a sudden, as you saw in a knee-jerk reflex, it was pretty sudden. The dilation of pupil was a sudden reflex. Involuntary response. So a reflex action is a sudden involuntary response of the body mediated by the nervous system. So what is bringing out these reflex actions? The nervous system. And reflex actions are always brought out as a response to some kind of a stimulus. So what is the importance of reflex actions? Now, reflex actions usually are involved in protection of the body from harmful stimuli. We can take a couple of more examples. For example, if a cracker bursts behind your back, your response is screaming, you're closing your eyes, putting your hands on your ears, and none of these acts are actually thought out. They just happen suddenly. So these are all reflex actions. Let us take an example of another very common reflex action. When you touch a hot pan which is on the gas stove, you end up moving your hand backwards really rapidly. That is also a reflex action. You didn't think of moving your hand away from the harmful stimulus. So reflex actions are usually protective in nature. They also have another role which is to prevent overstretching of muscles, but that is way beyond the scope of this particular session. So anyways, I hope you've understood what reflex actions are. There are just two properties of it. They are sudden and involuntary responses. Now, what brings about a reflex action? A reflex action is brought out by a certain set of neurons which work together, and they make up a structure called the reflex arc. Let us try to understand what a reflex arc. A reflex arc is a series of neurons. It is a series of neuronal connections through which nerve impulse passes to generate a reflex action. So there are three parts to the definition and we'll understand them slowly. It's a series of neuronal connections through which a nerve impulse passes. And why does it pass? The nerve impulse passes to generate a reflex action. Now let us understand this. So basically a reflex arc is a structure. It is a series of neurons. Now let us assume, or in this example what we see here is skin. So this part here is the skin, here is the skin, and the skin is pricked by a pin. Now the pressure of the pin, the pressure exerted by the pin is too high because of its pointed end, and this pressure is basically generating a stimulus, is providing a stimulus to sensory cells. The sensory cells are neurons. Now there are a wide variety of sensory cells. There are baroreceptors, thermoreceptors, photoreceptors, nociceptors, gustatory receptors, etc., etc., and all of these receptors have their own specialized functions. Now in this particular case, the receptor in the skin, this particular receptor that is involved, is a baroreceptor. Baro means pressure, so this sensory neuron is a pressure sensing neuron. So it detects small changes in pressure which does not stimulate the reflex arc. If you are simply touching the skin of a person, there will be no reflex action. However, when the stimulus is too strong, for example in the case of a pinprick or touching a hot pan, in case of a pinprick, the baroreceptor will be activated, it will be stimulated, and receptor cells are sensory neurons. So these are the dendritic ends. What has to be borne in mind at all the times is a signal always starts from the dendrite, moves to the cell body, and then to the axon terminals. So the sensory cell receives these inputs, and then these pressure stimuli are converted into electric signals, which is also called the nerve impulse. The nerve impulse travels via the axon, enters the central nervous system. So what are the different parts here? Let us also have a look. So the sensory neuron enters the spinal nerve. So now this is called the spinal nerve, the nerve that emanates or is connected to the spinal cord. And what do we have here? So this here is the spinal cord. Let's write SC. So this is the spinal cord, this whole region here, this is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is made up of two parts. You have the outer white matter and the inner gray matter. The same is the case with the brain, but in that case it's slightly different. But however, brain also contains the white matter and the gray matter. Now the sensory neuron enters the spinal nerve. So this is the spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve then divides into two parts. You have a dorsal root or a dorsal part of the spinal nerve, and you have a ventral root or the ventral part of the spinal nerve. Now the dorsal root of the spinal nerve is characterized by the presence of only sensory neurons. Now in this diagram, the nerve has only two neurons here, but it must be borne in mind that the nerve contains a large number of neurons. So there are large number of sensory neurons that enter into the dorsal root or the dorsal root of the spinal nerve. It's ganglion. Ganglion is nothing but a bunch. You can also call it as dorsal root of the spinal nerve. So a large number of sensory neurons enter the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and the signal, and they carry the signal. Let's just take a minute in choosing the marker and the fine tip. And the signal moves from the skin into the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and eventually it enters into the gray matter. Now remember, here we have the cell body of the sensory cell, and now this part is the axon. Now the axon enters into the gray matter of the spinal cord, and out there what do we have? This green cell is the interneuron or the relay neuron. The function of the relay neuron is to connect the sensory neuron to the motor neuron, but also to analyze the incoming signal and decide what has to be done with it. Should it take a immediate action, or should the signal be sent to the brain or some other part of the central nervous system? Well, so in case of such a strong stimulus, the relay neuron rapidly sends a message to the motor neuron in the form of nerve impulses. So some motor, there's just not one neuron involved, there are many sensory neurons and many motor neurons involved. So now the dendrites of the relay neuron receive the signal from the axons of the sensory neuron, the processing is done by the relay neuron, and then a particular decision is made and the signal is sent to the axon terminals of the relay neuron, which then pass on the signal to the dendrites of the motor neuron via chemical messaging, right? And now once this cell is activated, a signal is sent really rapidly to the effector cells, the muscles. Now where are these muscles present? These muscles are present in the same area as the area of the stimulus. So let us assume that you were pricked on your hind arm, on your bicep, let's say one of your muscles, your hind arm. Now the muscles involved will be those primarily involved, those of your arm, and you will move your arm away. Now there is just too much of a task that has been done. The signal has been taken, processed, and sent back with necessary action, information for necessary action. So you will move your arm away from the site of the pin or away from the pin, and this action barely takes fraction of seconds. So this is what a reflex arc is and how it works. Now some important points that we must also remember is what is this white area. The white matter and the gray matter differ in the presence of Schwann cells or myelin sheath. Now you must remember that myelin sheath, which are these Schwann cells that you see, the myelin sheath is made up of Schwann cells, and Schwann cells are rich in Schwann cells are rich in fats and lipids, and that's why they appear white, and that's why the dorsal ganglia and the ventral root and the white part of the spinal cord is white because they contain a lot of fat. The gray matter usually contains the cell body and the dendrites are not covered by the myelin sheath. In case of relay neurons, the relay neurons are also very poor in the presence of insulating lipid material, and hence we have the gray matter as gray and white matter as white. Anyways, let's proceed further on a few more topics that we need to discuss. So what is the role of brain in a reflex in reflex actions or in a reflex arc? Well, the spinal nerves are, so these are spinal nerves, the nerves that are connected to the spinal cord. Similarly, we also have nerves that are directly connected to the brain. Directly connected, there are large number of nerves that are directly connected to the brain, and those are called the cranial nerves. Now cranial nerves and spinal nerves both are involved in variety of reflex actions. Now only that particular arc is usually involved which is closest to the site of the stimulus. For example, if the stimulus is close to is near the arm, now the arms are closer to the upper part of the spinal cord than the brain. So the spinal nerves are involved in performing a reflex action on the arm. With related to feet, the lower parts of the spinal cord will be involved in generating a reflex action in the lower parts of the body. However, for example, in case of the eyes, the reflex action in case of the eyes, as we saw the first case of pupillary reflex of the eye, the cranial nerves are involved in this particular reflex. So what is the role of the brain in reflex actions? Well, they are also involved in reflex actions. There are these specific cranial nerves which are involved in reflex actions and spinal nerves. So we have a reflex arc both in the brain as well as in the spinal cord. Now, another important thing is that the brain is the organ where a huge amount of processing is done, a large number of decisions are made. Now, why do we have reflex arcs? Why do we have reflex arcs? Let's say here, so this is a reflex arc. I'm just drawing a few. There are like probably thousands and thousands of reflex arcs all over the spinal cord. So let's say we have these reflex arcs. I'm just drawing them in one particular direction. They can be in the other direction also. Now, there are so many reflex arcs. Why do we have reflex arcs in the spinal cord? Why not send the signal to the brain? Now, let us say you step. So let's say you have your foot and you step on, let's say, a piece of glass, and you are barefoot. So the moment you get pricked, you will move your foot away. Now, if this information is sent, let's use a marker, a blue marker for sensory neuron. Let's say your sensory neuron picks up a signal and sends it, let's say, to the closest part here, and the relay neuron out here. Let us use a green marker to use and let's say the relay neuron, rather than sending a signal to the motor neuron, sends it upwards to the brain for processing. It's going to take time because neuron to neuron connection, there is a delay because of the gap, because of the synaptic cleft. The electric impulse does not travel way too fast because of interruptions. But anyways, it does take a little time, which is a few seconds, let's say a couple of seconds. Now the signal is going to reach your brain, then it will be decided by a certain section of the brain where to send it for processing. So it will be sent to like 2, 3, 4 places, or maybe to one particular place. Then the information will be gathered, accumulated. So all of this is taking a lot of time, and then some decision will be taken, and a signal has to be sent back with a certain decisive action, and this process takes a lot of time. And in the meanwhile, your foot will be damaged even more, will be damaged even further. And that is where the importance of reflex arc comes into play. What the body has evolved into is an extremely efficient protective mechanism. The moment your foot is pricked, the relay neuron just figures out that the stimulus, the input of the signal is too strong, and it is essential that the foot should be moved away. So let us use a black marker for a motor neuron. So a signal is processed by the relay neuron, and a motor neuron carries the signal to the effector cell in the foot, which is the muscle, to move the foot away from the piece of glass so that more damage can be prevented. This does not mean, so what the reflex arc does is it rapidly moves your foot away, but that does not mean that information is not sent to the brain. The action is taken first via the reflex arc, the reflex action is taken first, and the information is sent to the brain that such and such an event has happened, so that the individual can be made aware and further steps can be taken to control the damage. Now, are reflex arcs connected to each other? Certainly they are. Now, we spoke of one of the examples before where we were talking about an explosion taking place behind your back. Let us say when you're standing somewhere or sitting somewhere, and all of a sudden you hear a very loud noise. You are focused at something, but you hear a very loud noise. Your reflexes are to move your hands to your ears. You end up closing your eyes, and probably you will even jump out of your seat, and you might even just run a couple of steps. And all of these actions that you will perform, you would have performed without thinking. And all of these acts would have been instantaneous. You might have observed this this particular situation when you faced a wild animal, maybe a violent dog or a monkey, right? So what does this tell us? It tells us that the stimulation of one particular reflex arc has the ability to also stimulate a couple of other reflex arcs. So let us say your ears heard, the stimulus was received by your ears, and that stimulus is sent down to a reflex arc, probably somewhere here, is sent to a reflex arc which controls your muscles in your legs and your back, etc., and probably even your eyes. So what does this tell us? It tells us that reflex arcs are also connected to each other, but it is not necessary that all of them are activated at the same time. So I hope you've understood what reflex arc is and how does it function, and what is the role of a reflex arc, and what reflex actions are. With this there's a delay in stopping the video.